Weirdness of Riverside High School. Through foggy school bus windows, students every morning looked upon their study place. In their eyes, Riverside High School turned out to be quite common and boring. For someone, it related to happy events, but for others, school was the most hated place on Earth. Millions of students around the world had the same attitude to schools as the Riverside High School pupils. However, Riverside High School wasn't quite a usual school. The fact that it was located in the small, insignificant woodland town made it even more remarkable. It was the only notable place in this area. If some lost tourist entered the town, this was the thing to see. The school roof towered upon the treetops after the last turn of the driveway. The building from the distance looked sophisticated and solemn. It was built in classicism style with white columns decorating the entrance. The first floor was elevated a little bit more than usual. Wide stairs led to the school entrance. High arched windows rose upon the white gravel paths with solemn presence. Though at first glance, it wasn't that eye-catching, an attentive viewer would immediately notice that something in this classicism building wasn't quite right. Behind the exquisite facade, something big and somber loomed. Quadratic, gray concrete walls rose behind the oblique classicism roof. When this building was viewed by someone for the first time, it left an incomprehensible impression. But when this someone started to go around the school, it became clear that the architecture of the building was in fact embodied in two completely different styles. Only 1/3 of this building reflected classicism, the other 2/3 were modern glass and concrete. The modern part of the school used all the practical benefits obtained from the square shape. And indeed, most student classes took place in these school wings. For a casual viewer, it would seem that oddities ended here, but he would be wrong. The closer one approached the school, the more visible became the fact that the classicism style wing was in a poor condition. The plaster had cracks, and it peeled off from the white columns. Stair steps were missing tiles. In many places, stair concrete was so severely damaged that the reinforcement rods had bared themselves to the world. The wall plaster peeled off too, but the roof had lost its impermeability in some places. The modern school part left a completely different impression after a closer inspection. It seemed to be sufficiently well built. The roof didn't have damages, the plaster didn't peel off. There were even some pretty sophisticated school laboratories inside, but all in all the design was tedious and oppressive. Those who didn't know anything about the construction of the Riverside High School thought that the classicism style wing was built much earlier than the modern part. That wasn't true. Both parts of the school were built approximately at the same time, the modern wings lagging behind only a few months. The problem was that the quality in the classicism wing was terrible, while the modern part was able to fit into the standard. This place just was like that. Few tourists came here and were awed by the strange contrast between styles and quality. After a while, they forgot about the place, but locals were used to it. They didn't consider it to be worthy of attention. John, Peter, and Mark were sitting in the Riverside High School's courtyard, near the sports ground. John and Peter were 16 years old, but Mark was 17 years old. They all studied in grade 11. The classes had come to an end for today, but it didn't really facilitate their lives. The guys had to create a group project in history until tomorrow, but none of them had started to do anything. Damn, again there'll be a debt until the end of the year, Mark said. We had to call Kathy with us, said Peter. No, it's stupid to pretend to be someone's friend just to benefit from a person. Or maybe you want to go on a date with her. Pete, John scoffed. You have no shame at all, you fools? If Kathy weren't a total nerd, then both of you would jump around that girl. She has a pretty face. Peter winced, but his friends didn't know that he was pretty much into this girl since the 9th grade. Okay, Mark. It's too late to invite her anyway. We have to figure out what to do now, Peter calmed Mark. I hate history, John sadly mumbled. The other two agreed. Mark pulled out of his pocket a packet of cigarettes, gave one to John and took one for himself. They were sure that teachers had gone home at this time. Peter was a non-smoker. While John and Peter were discussing would it be better to write about ancient Greece or Rome, Mark was blankly staring at the place where the classicism-style school wing joined with both modern-style school wings. Then he turned his gaze and noticed a sign pointing to Riverside High School as a tourist attraction. And then he got an idea. Hey, do Do you know why this shed looks like that? Mark gestured towards the school. What do you mean? John asked. He means those styles, Peter added. No, I don't know. Who is interested in shit like that? John answered. Our history teacher might be interested, so they decided to make a project about Riverside High School. The school library had an information about the school's origin for sure, so they went there. When all three arrived at the school library, Mrs. Straker was locking the door. What do you want? She screeched. We would like to get information about. You need to watch the clock. The library is closed. She left, her high heels echoing in the empty hallway. Mark looked at the clock on his phone. It showed 5:50 p.m. The library's working hours were till 6. Stupid, old hag. We'd have been able to find one book in 10 minutes. John cursed. Where do we find information about this school? There won't be anything on the internet. Now we probably have to make a project about Greece or something. Peter was reckoning when they were approaching the exit. What do you want to know exactly? A voice startled all three of them. That was a school janitor. No one ever paid attention to him like any other school janitor unless one became a subject of ridicule. However, now when the janitor had made himself noticeable, he didn't look so insignificant at all. His vivid black hair had some grizzled ones around the temples. They were cut short. Face features in the pale autumn light seemed a bit harsh, but his eyes were sharp and clear. He was one of those characters which during the dispute you would always want to put on your side and wouldn't want to meet in the dark alley alone. We'd like to know about the origin of this school. Why it has this oddity. I'll tell you better than any book, if there's such a wish. Guys looked at each other and read in friends' eyes that this was a gift of fate. Okay, Mr. Broomer. Mark too noticeably read janitor's tag card. Others tried to suppress giggles. Let's go to the bench, Mr. Brummer proposed. He brought them to the same bench where they'd been sitting before. Will you give me some cigarette? Mr. Brummer asked, sat down on the bench and stretched his hand towards Mark. All three looked at him dumbfounded. How did he know that Mark and John were smoking? The whole school knows that you are puffing here. If you think that it's a secret, then you're naive, janitor revealed. Mark pulled out a cigarette of his crumpled pack and gave it to the janitor. Mr. Brummer breathed in first smoke from all his heart. Then he was just sitting there with a burning cigarette between fingers. After this moment of silence, Brummer began his story. Construction of this building started 15 years ago. At that time, the school was still located in the old building from the 30s. It was in a terrible condition then. Present, that building doesn't exist anymore. It has been demolished. The county had announced a competition for the construction of a new school from public funds. Different companies had applied for the competition, but in the end, Mr. Goldberg's construction company won. The main problem throughout this event was that Mr. Goldberg's construction company was a small local company for whom it was very hard to compete against some bigger companies. Bigger ones got incredibly low construction material costs. However, Goldberg hadn't been born yesterday. He won the competition because he chose the cheapest materials from the start, and many believe that he bribed some significant people in the county. Later, Goldberg was criticized for losing a lot of money because of the fancy classicism design, but no one had thought about it at the beginning of construction. Goldberg was obsessed with his desire to immortalize himself in the school building, so that's why he chose this extravagant design. As a misfortune, Goldberg was also a ruthless man, and he didn't care at all about the safety and well-being of others. Construction was slow and tedious, but equipment insufficient and outdated. People demanded health insurance, which no one had. Goldberg was so annoyed by petitioners for better conditions that he started to reduce their salaries. In the end, workers obeyed because there were no other jobs in the town. No one tried to complain to building control authorities. If this had happened, then the construction definitely would have stopped. But without specific complaints, none of the higher authorities wanted to involve themselves in small towns' business. Because of the bad working conditions, accidents began to happen. I can't remember his name anymore, but some worker got severe facial injuries from a falling object due to the lack of a helmet. Another time, scaffoldings collapsed, and 2 people got bone fractures, while 2 more were lucky with lighter injuries. These injured employees were swiftly replaced. Newcomers were happy about the new job, but they didn't know what was waiting for them there. Other accidents happened too, but I won't recall them all. Despite all this mess, construction continued, but the school's opening term was approaching fast. The county, as soon as possible, wanted to transfer the children to the new school because they were afraid of the accident that could happen due to the bad condition of the old building. If something had happened to a child, then journalists probably would have shouted it all over the country. That couldn't be said about the simple workers. County started to poke Goldberg about the opening date, but the school's first wing was still far from ready. Goldberg decided to increase working hours and pay slightly more to propitiate employees. Of course, the salary increase wasn't proportional to the work done. And then death event happened. A few days before the opening, Goldberg decided to visit the construction site in person. The workers rushed to finish final touches. Despite all the problems, the construction was almost completed, but Goldberg noticed fateful failure. "Where is my statue?" he exclaimed back then when he'd entered the building site. And that was true. In the project, it was intended to install the statue of Mr. Goldberg on the school roof, but it wasn't there. He called the supervisor and complained to him about the fact that the statue hadn't been installed. Finally, it all came so far that Goldberg demanded that the statue should be installed right away. "There isn't enough staff, at least 8 workers are required." Supervisor told him something like that. In fact, there were 8 workers on the field, but some of them should have gone home by then because they'd worked for 24 hours straight. Goldberg wasn't satisfied with that. In his mind, the statue had to be installed that day. They discussed a lot with the supervisor, but after all the arguing, Goldberg announced that nobody was allowed to go home until his statue would be installed. So all 8 workers climbed up on the scaffoldings while the crane was lifting the statue. Unfortunately, it wasn't possible to use a crane for statue's positioning. Roof's protrusion obstructed this task. The staff had to hold the statue in their hands. While 6 of them were holding the statue, 2 of them were screwing it into place. That day, a strong wind was blowing, and Hank Sheldon was one of those who had been working for 24 hours straight. Some industrial oil had been spilled on the statue, so when he grabbed it, it slipped out of his hands. Hank lost his balance and fell down. Because of the great hurry, nobody used the security straps. It's possible that Hank would have survived, but because of the sudden balance loss, the crew let go of the statue, and it fell too. The bottom of the statue fell directly on Hank's head. It was crushed like an egg. The brains splattered all around. Goldberg's and supervisor's trousers got smeared with it, as well as the still bright white entrance columns. Goldberg exclaimed, "My statue! You ruined my statue!" Statue's head after the fall was broken. The funeral after this event was held with a closed coffin lid. From the human's head, almost nothing was left over. What does it all have to do with the modern part of the school? And how do you know it all so well? Mark stopped the janitor's story. "Because I was one of those workers up there," Brummer said. "I saw all this with my own eyes. And then Goldberg got crazy, so he changed the school style?" John added. "No." Mr. Brummer was slightly unsatisfied. "Do you want to hear everything? Or not?" "Yes, we want. Please tell us." After all these events, the statue didn't get installed, but the school's first wing was ready to pick up the students in time. The opening ceremony took place the day before opening. It happened in the new school hall. Goldberg had prepared a speech and went to the pedestal to give it. In the hall, mainly the pupils' parents with their children had gathered. Many of the fathers had taken part in school's construction. When speech was halfway through, Hank Sheldon's 7-year-old boy ran in front of the pedestal. "You're guilty that Dad isn't with me anymore. I loved my dad," the boy cried. The whole hall got silent, and Goldberg stopped his speech too. Mary Sheldon was rushing to get her son, but before she succeeded, the boy exclaimed once more, "You're a murderer, a murderer, a murderer! Die, die, die!" Then Mary grabbed him and was dragging boy away. At that moment, the cable that held the stage illumination snapped. The lamp hit Goldberg directly on the head. He'd felt the impending misfortune and had looked up, so he received the lamp right in his face. All those which were present at that time still remember the disgusting crack of human neck snapping. Goldberg's head was struck to the back with a great force. The corner of the lamp knocked out his eye from its socket, and it rolled along the central aisle to the boy's feet. Fate had decided that Goldberg's own poor attitude to the quality of work and his employees killed him. Later, the official report confirmed that the accident had happened due to the poor quality of mounting cables. This event was the end of Mr. Goldberg's construction company. He didn't have a wife or children who would take over the company, and none of the other leading executives had the iron fist which was needed for the small company to survive. After a week, large construction company took over school building. It provided health insurance for employees and adequate equipment. This company categorically rejected the idea of continuing to build school in the style of classicism. It was just too expensive for the funds given. That's the story of this school. An ambitious person who wanted to immortalize himself here found his own end and brought along another person. In a way, he succeeded even more than if the school would have been completed in a normal way. I think that you also won't forget this tale that fast. After the end of the story, everyone fell silent for a moment. Mark looked at the clock on his phone. It was 7:30. "Thank you very much, Mr. Brummer, but it's time for us to go," he finally said. It was true because they had to make their school presentation till tomorrow. That's how this brief meeting with janitor ended for Mark, Peter, and John. The next day, they presented his story. Everybody got a D grade due to lack of quotation from information sources. However, none of them worried about that because they had succeeded anyway, and this wasn't going to be another debt. While students were defending their group works, the janitor was sitting in his office and eating. After the lunch, he pulled out of the drawer a cut from the newspaper. The article said, "Owner of greedy construction company becomes a victim of his own project." Above the article was a photography that depicted the freshly completed first wing of Riverside High School. At that time, 2 modern wings weren't under construction yet. However, nobody knew the complete story of Riverside High School. Before Mr. Goldberg began his death speech 15 years ago, someone had sneaked behind the stage. In one hand, this person had clenched large metal cutters. If anyone had spotted this person back then, he or she would have recognized that it had been subsequent school janitor Roger Brummer. No one no longer remembered that at that time Brummer's best friend had been Hank Sheldon. The Magic School Bus Lost. Does anybody remember the show The Magic School Bus? It was a children's cartoon show in the 90s where a crazy science teacher would take students on weekly adventures into places such as into space or through the human digestive system. What most people don't know about the show was that it was meant to fit into a line of horror stories for kids before the concept spiraled horrifically out of control and most likely terrified test audiences. Originally planned by PBS, it was designed by Melnitsa Animation Studio in Russia, and thus the original pilot episode was partially animated in Russia before being chopped at the 5-minute mark to be a kids' series. In the original episode, the doubting school children were brought onto a school bus. Originally, the bus had no eyes, that transformed into a spacecraft and brought them into space, where strange things began to happen. As such, the episode starts normally. The recut includes the original PBS episode 1, but the music is different, with an infinitely descending Shepard's tone replacing the happy intro. The title screen is merely black, with the words over what must be an English translation that says, "The Sad Bus." After some resarch, I found that it said, "I cannot breathe." I only saw the episode in a recut through a friend in Russia who had VHS taped it and sent it to me with the explicit note that I do not share it due to legal disclosures. I am guessing that the recut didn't include the bus eyes, but I'm not sure whether it's layering or horror that 2 of the student characters, Carlos and Dorothy, and aren't there either. I mean, they are there, but their eyes are missing and no one mentions it. The bus also looks much more sinister because the front lights are normal, though still eye-like, and the grille of the bus just looks extremely sad, like it's in a constant frown. The voice work is also different, with a sense of sorrow in the American actors' voices. In the PBS edition, Arnold's cousin Janet thinks that Mrs. Frizzle is boring, so Arnold has the teacher take them into space. In this episode, going into space is where things become very messed up. Nothing from the original episode is here. Instead, the bus transforms into a spaceship, kind of like one you'd see in a film like 2001, A Space Odyssey. There's no transition, it just becomes this. The walls are all white and there seem to be infinite corridors with steep drops. From the outside, it looks like a Soviet space rocket, but larger. Arnold comments that this wasn't what he expected and he wants to go home. Janet and Carlos also seem equally confused, but Janet is smiling. Mrs. Frizzle says that there is an override lock on the ship and nobody can leave until it has reached its destination. We are hurtling toward the sun. Mrs. Frizzle tells everyone that she can either turn off the airlock and suffocate everyone, only jokingly, before saying that she will put in the manual override, but it will take 6 months to reach Earth. She suggests that everyone go into stasis sleep. A cancerous sore has developed on Mrs. Frizzle's face, but nobody makes any mention of it. There is a problem, however. There are only 9 stasis beds and 11 people, including Mrs. Frizzle. Mrs. Frizzle tells them that she'll be fine staying up for 6 months, but one of the students will have to stay up as well. Ralphie suggests they draw straws. They do so, and Arnold is determined to be the one who has to stay up. Now up to this point, the episode was bafflingly strange, but this is where the show descends into realms that I couldn't make up if I tried. Mrs. Frizzle tells Arnold that originally there were 30 students in the class, but 20 of them died. She tells Arnold she is going into the upper airlock where there is a separate bed, and she only told the students there were less beds because she didn't want them to face the idea that one person would be alone for 6 months. And the time frame for returning home isn't 6 months, but rather 2 years. She leaves and locks the door behind her from the outside. You can only tell that time is progressing because Arnold is proceeding to grow more unkempt, nervous, and dirty. The 9 beds line the walls, and there are porthole windows along with a control panel that is deactivated. The food that was left for him sits in one corner of the room. He tries to ration it, but there is only enough for what seems to be a month. He also has no means of a bathroom, so he urinates and defecates on the floor. After about 2 minutes, 2 months have passed, and Arnold is looking noticeably nervous and disheveled. He's extremely hungry, more so than he's ever been. Ralphie's catchphrase, "I think I'm gonna be sick," begins to play, repetitively, over the music track. I think it was meant to reflect Arnold's mind. But then Mrs. Frizzle begins to talk. "You're hungry, aren't you?" Arnold now realizes the predicament he faces. He won't survive 2 years in this environment, and if he tries to kill himself by smashing a porthole window, he'll kill his other students. "You didn't leave me enough food," Arnold screams. The voice begins to grow darker and more tinged, and deeper. "Oh, but Arnold, I did." The animation does a long, slow pan across the room with what looks like a stylization of a wide-angle lens, pointing out the beds. And then the voice changes. "I am your extrasensory nervous system. This is no hallucination, Arnold. I am you." The weirdest and most convincing thing about the animation of the original episode is that Arnold looks very similar to Mrs. Frizzle. One would think they are related. They both have pale skin, orange hair, and represent nerds. Even their mannerisms, aside from Mrs. Frizzle's greater achieved sense of confidence, have their similarities. The voice began to whisper, "Eat them." Arnold had attempted to analyze the space chart over the defunct control panel for some time, but only now, realizing that he was intentionally trapped here, did it make sense. The path wasn't leading to Earth. It was heading for a malformed black hole that had strangely appeared to the left of the moon. Through whatever means, the room was also becoming increasingly hot, so much so that Arnold had to take off all but his underwear. The unclean environment was forcing him to develop sores, as he slept on his side in a mat before ritualistically taking Carlos from the bed so he could sleep there at night. That was when he made the horrible realization that none of them were breathing. Mrs. Frizzle hadn't put them into stasis. She euthanized them. It was only after he had made this realization that a scalpel appeared near the door. Someone had opened it while he was sleeping and moved the bodies around. The words, "Beret See Hope," are scrawled in English on the wall in marker. The increasing need to eat was more apparent now than ever. He looked at Phoebe. He secretly loathed her. This became all the more apparent as he took the scalpel and slowly cut into her belly. He was not at all hesitant now. This scene is the most disturbing because the angle never changes. His expression is always angry, with cartoon-stylized eyebrows. For an entire 60 seconds he slices her open, eats her lungs and intestines, peels and eats her skin, then moves on to the face, slicing off eyebrows and the nose, leaving a shaved skeletal corpse as the camera time-lapses. The animation is different here, it's more specific, more layered, and more medical-looking. Now the cancerous sores are visibly on Arnold's face as well. The next day the scalpel is removed. For the next month or so, he picks on the remains of Phoebe. The next time-lapse seems more messed up, because now Arnold seems to have begun to hit puberty. He has nibbled on the ears and fingers of every student except Janet because it's his cousin. The scalpel appears again, this time with the words, "A moral scorn," written on the wall. Arnold talks to himself frantically. What does that mean? What does that mean? He picks up the scalpel and decides who to eat next. He never liked Carlos either. As he undresses Carlos and begins to slice into him, the student ID falls out of his pocket. He says, "Carlos Ramon. A moral scorn. Carlos Ramon." It was an anagram, just as Beret C. Hope was an anagram for Phoebe Teresa's name. By now the episode is almost over, and the screen begins to flicker as Arnold starts to gasp for air. You knew Arnold begins to cry. The animation gets very choppy at this point. Two different shots are seen. In one, the school bus collides with the sun. In another, Arnold continues to eat the remaining students in order, based on the anagram instructions. Since it's a time lapse, you only see the bodies and the bones begin to pile up. He refuses to eat Janet, his cousin, before ultimately slicing his neck with the scalpel and killing himself. The cancerous sores envelop his corpse. The retrograde film begins to deteriorate before the Russian words appear. This directly translates to, "Whatever happened to Janet?" There's nothing else. The ship enters a black hole and there are no credits. Instead, we just hear Arnold profusely screaming that he can't breathe as a burning noise begins to envelop the back layer track. It goes on for a full 3 minutes. I tried figuring out what happened to Janet, but the only real clue is, I suppose, in the animation itself.